Shmona Prakim, and essentially we're going to do some of these Prakim are very, very short and literally just a few sentences. So we're really up to Perek Shlishi, the third Perek. And the third Perek, the Rambam draws on medical analogies, and he makes the point that just as a human body can be in a state of health or a state of sickness, so too a soul can be a healthy soul or a sick soul. And the definition of a healthy body, sick body, is discussed by medicine. And he makes the point that one of the characteristics of a sickness is that there will be a distortion in perception as to what is good and what is bad. So, for example, a sick person might actually enjoy the taste of dirt or rocks or whatever it would be, because the taste itself gets distorted, and therefore the person is doing things that are actually injurious to them, but they think they're beneficial, meaning they're different levels of being physically sick. There's a physically sick person who knows that he's sick, and that's a madrega. You know that you're sick. And then there's a physically ill person who doesn't even have an awareness that they're sick, and as a result, they will engage in behavior that is destructive, but that they think is beneficial and even enjoyable. Just derech agav, I remember, apropos of nothing, but I remember this. I saw when the Rebbe, in fact, the Rebbe's yard site was on Shabbos, Gimel Tammuz, that he was giving out dollars. You know, people would go in front of him. So in one of them, there was a fellow who was a Jew who became a Jew for Jesus. He became like a Christian missionary, and he wanted to give the Rebbe like messianic literature. It's a little crazy. So the person starts saying, you know, the old line, I'm a Jew, I'm proud to be a Jew, but you know, I'm also a Catholic, and I found God this way, etc. So the Rebbe was saying in English, he had the kind of the European accent in English, he said, the greatest sickness a person can have is when they don't know that they're sick. Says that's the greatest sickness. So my prayer is that you should know that you're sick. And then once you know that you're sick, then you can go to the appropriate doctor for the healing of the soul. And the guy kept on saying, oh, I'm doing well, I'm doing great, I feel great, I'm spiritually great, etc. And the Rebbe kept on repeating, the biggest sickness is when you don't know that you're sick. That's the So my prayer is that you should know that you're sick. And then the Rebbe took the literature, and then as the guy walked away, he threw it in the garbage, and he said, I'm taking it so there'll be one less person in the world that he'll be able to give it out to. But all right. Anyway, this is the Rambam's point, that indeed, exactly what the Rebbe said, the Rambam said it first, that the greatest sickness in life is not even to be aware that there's a problem. Because once you're aware there's a problem, medically, you can do something about it, and spiritually, you can do something about it, right? But when you don't live in a state of awareness, then you're not going to be able to do anything at all. And this is what the Svarim say generally. The first step in, if you're lost, the first step in finding the way is to recognize that you're lost. I think I said the story before. You know, when I lived in Silver Spring, Maryland, and I had to commute to Baltimore, that's where I was teaching law. So if you know the road system there, you go on a highway called 95, and you have to go 95 north, because Silver Spring is south, is near Washington, D.C. So, but the problem is when you're driving on 95 north, there's a turnoff, and you can easily find yourself on 95 south. So in my early years, when I wasn't so familiar with the roads, so I'm driving on 95 north, and I was thinking about different stuff. So all of a sudden I noticed the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial. If you know, that means you're headed into Virginia, which is 95 south. So I kind of panicked because, because I didn't even know how to get back. I said, did I take 95 south? How did I get on 95 south anyway? So I didn't want to acknowledge, I can't even explain the process, I didn't want to acknowledge to myself that I was on 95 south, because that would have meant admitting I was lost and I didn't know how to fix it. So I started telling myself, maybe you can see the Washington Monument from 95 north going to Baltimore. Maybe you're not lost, just you never noticed those things. on the side of the road. So as a result, I continued going the wrong way because I didn't want to admit I was on the wrong way, because it would have been too much trouble to get onto the right way. And somehow, this is what's called magical thinking, I thought if I just keep on going, somehow things will correct themselves. Now, it is true that they do correct themselves eventually, because 95 South goes to Key West, Florida. So, once you hit Key West, you just do a U-turn, and you're back on 95 North. But that would have taken a long time, and I certainly would have been late for class. So what does a person have to do? I mean, this is done every time in life. This is called throwing good money after bad. A person invests money in a business and it's losing money. Oh, I'm going to put some more money in, and that's going to make it better. And everyone knows Albert Einstein's famous statement: the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and assume you're going to get different results. You're going to do the same thing over and over again. It's not going to be different the 10th time or the first time. So all of this means that a person has to be honest and recognize that they have a problem. If, God forbid, there's a health problem, you got to recognize that. That's the only way you can deal with the health problem. That's called refuas haguf. And that's equally true for refuas hanefesh. If I have a problem in midos, I have an anger problem, I have an impatience problem, a taiva problem, whatever it is, just recognizing that there's an issue instead of sweeping it under the rug is already an enormous step towards trying to do something about it. So the Rambam points out that it is the nature of all types of sicknesses, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, that people are often in a state of denial. And that's a real chaval, because when you're in a state of denial, you're not able to do anything about your circumstance. So he does make the point, therefore, that a person has to be willing and courageous enough to be margish that they are in a state of choli and the like. Now, and he says that just as an undiagnosed or an unrecognized medical condition can lead to death, Rahman al-Islam, so too an undiagnosed spiritual condition can lead to kind of a death of your neshama, the death of your spirituality, the death of your connection to God. Now again, there's always tshuva, tshuva can bring you back from the dead. That's very true. But in terms of your present relationship, you can bring it mamish to a standstill unless you have the vigilance, unless you have the honesty, the self-awareness to understand what is going on. So that's really the thesis of Perek Gimel, the need of self-awareness, the need of honesty, the idea of drawing an analogy between refuas hanefesh and refuas haguf. Now he draws another analogy as well, and that is, and this was based on the description of medicine in the ancient world, that going back into the understanding of medicine, we don't use the same vocabulary today, but the underlying ideas are there. Going back to the ancient famous physicians, Hippocrates, Galen, right? These are Greek and Roman physicians that the Rambam looked at. Aristotle was not a doctor, but Aristotle wrote about medicine. These were the classical sources that the medieval world looked to for medicine. So they talked about all illness comes from imbalance, right? You had what are called the four humors, four types of fluids that operate within the body, the white and the yellow and the black and the red, different types of humors they were called. And when they're in a state of imbalance, that there's more of one than the other, you have various illnesses that happen, right? So some might cause depression, some might cause anger. That's because the forces of the body are not aligned in the proper way. And illness comes when there's imbalance and distortion. And here the Rambam says spiritual illness also comes when there's imbalance and distortion. And this brings us now to Perek Revi, the fourth Perek, which by far is the longest Perek in the Shmoyne Prakim. Perek Gimel is very short. Perek Daled is very, very big. And the Rambam develops the idea that the soul becomes sick as a result of being in a state of spiritual imbalance. And this is where the Rambam articulates the famous idea that you have to avoid extremities in both directions. We'll give some examples of that. And you have to find the middle path where this side and that side are balanced, and you're not more in one direction than you are in the other direction. So first, the Rambam says that, and this he said many times already, and he's going to say it many times because this is a central theme, that midos are a product of self-education, and the self-education is primarily by repetitive action, meaning to say you act in a certain way that trains your neshama to have certain feelings and certain emotions. This is a very, very important idea because most of us look at life that our actions are a consequence of our emotional state. When I'm angry, I lash out. When I'm happy, I express joy. When I feel love, I show love. When I feel hate, I show hate. Right? The normal cause and effect that we posit is I have certain feelings and they determine the actions unless I control myself or whatever it would be. The Rambam says, of course that's true. Of course, actions come from feelings and emotions. But we have to understand the opposite idea, that actions can also train your feelings and emotions. Right? This is referred to by the Sefer HaChinuch, who bases it on the Rambam. Adam nifal kefi pulosav. A person is spiritually aroused based on their actions. So instead of saying, I feel love, and therefore I act in a loving way, which of course is true, but one should also say, by acting in a loving way, I can train myself to feel love towards someone that I might not otherwise feel love. In other words, your actions are not just the consequence of your emotions, but your actions are the educators of your emotions. And the Rambam says, by repetitive actions of goodness, you train yourself to be a good person. And chas v'shalom, by repetitive actions of cruelty or meanness or selfishness, you can train yourself, if you'd want to, or why would you want to be a selfish person. Okay, this is a very, very important yesod, that we look at emotions as kind of a given. That's the way I am. And then I either control my actions or I don't control my actions. Okay, a righteous person controls, a non-righteous person doesn't control. But be it as it may, my emotions are the fixed star in the firmament. The Rambam is saying no. Emotions change. Emotions can be educated. Emotions can be channeled. They can be directed. But the primary avenue of changing your emotion is not so much philosophy and it's not so much thinking about it, although that's part of it. It is action itself. Action itself is the primary mechanism that directs your emotion. So a marriage counselor might tell a husband or a wife that says, I don't feel love towards my wife, or vice versa. I don't feel love towards my husband. So one of the things a marriage counselor might say is, why don't you act as if you felt that way? And then see what happens. Because you understand that, number one, the behaviors itself educate you. Number two, the behaviors also elicit a response on the part of the other person that may show you many positive aspects that you may have overlooked. So the Rambam then makes the point that he makes again in Pirkei Avos, that the thing that really molds your character is repetition of the action. Again, going back to the marriage counselor, the marriage counselor, the therapist, gives the husband a whole schmooze, how he has to show more affection to his wife. So he comes back next week and says, I gave her flowers before Shabbos and it didn't change it. And then he did one thing. He says, I did something, how come? Well, the answer is it's not one thing. That's maybe the hard news. It's kind of doing things over a long period of time. And I think I mentioned this to you, so forgive me for repeating it. That's why the Rambam says if you're trying to mold your character to feel generous and kind towards people, it's better to do a small action many times than a big action just once. He gave the example of tzedakah. If I have, let's assume I'm selfish, beteva, and I want to learn to be a more caring person. So one of the ways I do that is by making myself behave generously. Initially, I don't enjoy it. Initially, I hate it. But over time, I become a more generous person. So let's assume I have $1,000 to give away. Should I give $1,000 to one yeshiva? Or should I give $1 to 1,000 different people? So the Rambam actually writes, giving $1 to 1,000 different people is going to have a stronger effect on your character, on your midos, than giving $1,000 once to one institution, because the Rambam says it is the constant repetition of action that is your educator. Now, I had mentioned that it's interesting that lahalacha we may not follow this Rambam because tzedakah has other purposes, meaning if I'm using tzedakah as a character builder, then eino chinami, according to the Rambam, it's better to give $1 to 1,000 people. But you see, that's not the only purpose of tzedakah. The purpose of tzedakah is also to help people that need help. And that would be mechayev, that you put your money where it does the most good. Now let's imagine, when I give $1 to 1,000 people, it depends, but usually I really haven't helped them that much. What are they going to get for $1? If I give $1,000 to a yeshiva, then I may have done something very significant. So it's interesting how you balance this, meaning to say, we don't always have clear guidance, meaning, should my goal be the maximization of the good that I accomplish, or should the goal be which will be masake in my midos to the highest level? Now, you have to understand, the Rambam is not giving you a halachic directive that it's better to give $1 to 1,000 people. He's just telling you, if and when your goal is tikkun hamidos, then $1 to 1,000 people is a bigger tikkun hamidos than $1,000 once. But the Rambam is not addressing what you might call the question above that, the meta question, and that is, when do I decide what my dominant purpose in the tzedakah is? Perhaps you should split your tzedakah. Perhaps you should say, 50% is character building, and 50% is maximization of good. And that would determine the maximization of good is to give something to every beggar in the street, give something 1,000,000 times, in spite of the fact that the individual small contribution is not likely to do a good thing. So this is actually a very, very difficult question, because the Rambam gave us a guideline, but people have to understand the Rambam is not giving you a halachic guideline. The Rambam is just telling you that if your goal is tikkun hamidos is generated by repetitive action. But this is a very important yesod. Again, maybe we've heard it so much that maybe it's obvious to us, but this is actually a chiddush. A lot of times, things that seem to be so familiar to us, and we say, what's the big point? We don't always recognize that they are chidushim that are being said here that over the centuries have become part of the common understanding of things. But they were a chiddush. And the chiddush is, emotions are not static. Emotions are changing. Emotions can be educated. And as I mentioned before, the concept that the mind rules over the heart doesn't only mean self-control, meaning I feel angry, but I hold myself back. It's a much deeper idea that the mind can actually re-educate the emotions, but the primary vehicle by which that re-education takes place is not mental activity. When I say the mind, rather the mind directs you to do virtuous activity, physical activity, and that is the process of education of the soul. So the soul is educated by action, The actions are determined by the mind as to what are the appropriate virtuous actions. Okay, so it's not a mental process. Now, let me just mention that in reality, one might say this is a machlokes tanoim, a very, very interesting machlokes. Everyone knows a few weeks ago in Parshas Kedoshim, we read the famous pasuk, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha." You should love your friend like you love yourself. This is the mitzvah d'oraisa of Avas Yisrael. And in the Teiras Kayanim, in the Medrash, it says, this famous statement of Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Akiva said, Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is a fundamental principle of the Torah. Some translate that to mean the most important principle of the Torah. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Ben Azai has a different pasuk. I'll give you a pasuk that's more important. It says, this is the book of the generations of man, the day that God made man in the image of God. Tselem Elokim is the most important principle. So the Malbim is Masber. Very, very beautiful that Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai are focusing on different ways of developing your character in becoming a more loving person. The Malbim points out, when the Torah says, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, what is the Torah commanding? Is the Torah commanding emotion? Or is the Torah commanding virtuous behavior? The Malbim points out, if the Torah is commanding you to feel love for another person, it wouldn't have said, V'ahavta l'reacha. L means two. T-O. It would have said, V'ahavta es reyacha. It says by God, V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha. Why doesn't it say, V'ahavta es reyacha? L'reyacha, the preposition to, implies, says the Malbim, that V'ahavta in that pasuk does not mean feel love, but it means act in a loving manner. V'ahavta l'reyacha. Show love, benevolence, and caring to your friend. That's the diak. It is a commandment of virtuous action. And Rabbi Akiva is making the point, exactly as the Rambam makes the point, that through the actions of Ava, you will come to the emotion. Now, when Ben Azai brings the other pasuk, that man is made in God's image, Ben Azai is basically saying, oh, you know how you come to love another person? By thinking about their greatness, by thinking about the fact they're the image of God, by thinking of the godless Habore, and then recognize that within every human being, Jew and non-Jew, there is the spirit and the breath of God. So in effect, the Malbim says that the machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai is, how do you come to become a loving person? Rabbi Akiva says, by action. Ben Azai says, by contemplation of the godless ha'adam. Now it's interesting. You know, Ben Azai was considered to be one of the greatest of the Tanoim. In fact, years later, centuries later, when Abaye was describing when he was able to have clarity in learning, he said, I feel like Ben Azai in the streets of Tiberia, meaning my head is working at full capacity today. I mean, you imagine this, like centuries later, Ben Azai was still held up as the model of clear thinking. Right? That's what Abaye was boasting. I feel like Ben Azai today. Now, the Gemara in Yevamos discusses the mitzvah of getting married and the chiyuv of pru urvu. But it mentions that Ben Azai didn't get married. Ben Azai said, how can I get married? Nafshi chashka b'Torah. My soul desires to learn. I can't get married. I can't pull myself away from learning to have a family. So as a result, state in the Gemara, it's a kind of a pella, Ben Azai didn't get married. He said, Nafshi chashka b'Torah. we used to call, when I was in yeshiva, so we had some older bachelors, so we used to call them, they're members of the Ben Azai Club. Nafshe Cheshke B'Torah, didn't get married. Okay. Now, Tosfos brings the following. Tosfos says, although the Gemara says Ben Azai didn't get married, he in fact did get married, but he was divorced. And the person he married was none other than Rabbi Akiva's daughter. Ben Azai was Rabbi Akiva's daughter, and they got divorced. So I'm going to give you a pshat that I have absolutely no makor for, and it's total guesswork, total speculation. So you can accept it or reject it. It may not be emes, but I don't know. I have a gut feeling that it might be emes. And that is, let's imagine that you're Ben Azai, and you're a person who is so connected to learning that you can't possibly imagine how can I get married, have a family, have kids. I mean, I have to be connected to Torah. But there's a mitzvah to get married, a mitzvah to have children. So you look for a shidduch in which the impositions of marriage and parenting are going to be at the rock bottom minimum. So you look around at Rabbi Akiva's family. Rabbi Akiva didn't even begin to learn till he was 40. His wife was living in poverty. Her father was the richest person, but he was so angry that she married an ignorant shepherd that he excommunicated her. She sends Rabbi Akiva away for 12 years to learn. And after the 12 years, she says, with him not even saying hello, he can go back for another 12 years. He comes back after 24 years with 24,000 Talmidim. So Ben Azai figures, like mother, like daughter. Well, if I have to get married, maybe Rabbi Akiva's daughter is my best bet, because her mother let her husband learn without any disturbing for 24 years. Difference is, the daughter may have suffered from that, and the daughter was not going to settle for a life that way. So my totally unfounded speculation is that the divorce may have been because of that issue exactly. Ben Azai expected that Rabbi Akiva's daughter would be exactly like her mother, and when she wasn't, it wasn't shayach for the zivug to be Eila Yafa. Why am I bringing this in? I'm bringing this in because I think it shows you the limitations of trying to become a loving person via philosophy. You think about the gadlus ha'adam, you think about how wonderful everybody is, but that doesn't yet give you the ability in the here and now to deal with all of the distractions of everyday life. Meaning, philosophy is wonderful, in which I'm sitting by myself in a room and I'm filled with love of all humanity. I think about how wonderful everybody is, how great they are. But then somebody asks me for a favor and I think, I wish they'd stop bothering me all the time. So Rabbi Akiva's point is, let's get away from trying to improve our midos just by thinking about them. We improve our midos by acting upon them. And going back to the Malbim doesn't bring in the whole thing about Ben Azai, but going back to the Malbim says that's goof of the machlekes, Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai, whether we improve our character by action or we improve our character by machshav. And the truth is both are emes, but the primary vehicle is going to be action, and this is what the Rambam says. Even though the Rambam obviously was a great, phenomenal intellectual who was obviously into philosophy and thought, of course, that's what the Rambam is. But he says, Tikkun HaMidos comes, it does come from awareness. You have to have awareness, but it comes from virtuous action. It is repetitive action that trains our midos. Now, I know some of you learn Alei Shur, Rav Volba's classic, beautiful sefer. So you know Alei Shur comes in 2 volumes. Volume 1 is relatively thin, not thin, but medium. And volume 2 is real fat, big volume 2. So the difference. Volume 1 is the theoretical structure of Musar and Midas. And Rav Wolbe does a masterful job. It's really a masterpiece, bringing in Makoros regarding understanding your personality, understanding Midas, understanding Musar, understanding your goals in life. And that's volume 1. Volume 2 is about creating vadim, creating group Musar, which involves exercises. It's almost like a workbook. Volume 2 is almost a workbook for volume 1, in which, okay, for this week, your job is to be makabel kol adam b'sever panim yafos, right? And if you look at volume, in fact, Rav Wolbe even says in the Akdama to volume 2 that if you're not interested in actually working on your midos, says don't bother with volume 2. Volume 1 will give you the theoretical structure, but volume 2 is a lemaisa, and the lemaisa is extremely important. Sometimes we are so enamored of theoretical structures that we don't necessarily want to get our hands dirty, so to speak, with actual virtuous action. Okay, so this is a big yesod, and it goes back to the idea that according to the Rambam, virtuous action is good not only because it's virtuous action, it's good because it turns you into a certain type of person. That also is a chiddush, because one could have said, chesed is good because I'm doing chesed. I think that would be the same. It's good to do chesed. Yeah, it is good to do chesed. But the kinate here is a little different. It's not good to do chesed only because it's good to do chesed. It's good to do chesed because it makes you into a different type of person. So in a sense, there's kind of a rebound effect, meaning to say the chesed I do bounces back to me, and it makes me a different type of human being. Okay, in that sense, you could almost say that all of the chesed and the like, I wouldn't say selfish isn't the right word, but there is a selfish benefit in the sense that it changes you and makes you a different way. Okay, so that's a very, very important yesod of Adam Nifal Kefi Pulosav, that we educate ourselves, and the Rambam's point is by repetitive action. And here the Rambam says quantity is better than quality, meaning to say small, constant actions are greater educators than sporadic, occasional, dramatic actions. The reishim on the neshama, the impression on the neshama, comes from repetition. Yeah.
So the Rambam, the model that he has, I see how everybody's applying it for let's say positive actions, like love, like Harav. But let's say negative actions or negative emotions even, like kina or taiva, public.
Yeah.
How would this model be applied to those?
Well, we would really go through the same. We really would go through the same process. So, for example, we would say that let's say you have a kavod problem, right? So you go out of your way to avoid situations that give you kavod. Meaning, let's assume you have to kind of always be recognized as the best in that, right? So you kind of force yourself not to do that till you eventually care about it less. Now, in some ways, that's a little dangerous because sometimes you might be building up anger and resentment that you're not getting the kavod that you need, so you need to be sure that you're not veering in one direction. In fact, Rav Tzadok points out an interesting point. This is a Hasidic point. He says the two primary Yetzer Haras that we have, again, there are different ways of enumerating it, but this is taiva and kavod, meaning we're lazy and we like physical pleasure. That's taiva. That can include money, that can include food, whatever it is, sex, laziness, all of that is taiva. And the other is kavod, I need my ego to be stoked. And that can result in anger and the like. So he says what happens basically is kind of a no-win proposition. When one Yetzer Hara gets conquered, the other one gets stronger. Meaning to say, when I conquer my taiva, I'm likely to get angrier. Now, you can see that. I mean, in a very simple case. You want to give up smoking. Right? So every smoker will say that they become more irritable. Right? Person's on a diet, they become more grouchy. It's exactly the case. As the taiva, as I try to conquer my taiva, the anger, and which is connected to ego, gets more strong. So you have to be very careful. In the sense, like Rav Tzadok writes, that anger is a bigger avla than even taiva. Now the Gemara may be chaylik in that, but so you have to know. Maybe it's not time to give up smoking yet. Whatever it would be. So that's going to be the problem. In all of this type of avodah, you have to measure what the ripple effects are in other parts of your personality. That's why it is. You are correct. Working on eradicating negative habits is a difficult avodah because sometimes you might wind up with a negative that's worse than that which you started off with. Rav Dessler writes about this a lot. Rav Dessler writes about chumras. Is it good to be machmir on things? So, but pashtus, we would say, sure. Why not be machmir? Why not? So Rav Dessler points out that we do have like limited spiritual energies. Our spiritual energies at any given point in time is like a tablecloth that is too small for the table, or a bed sheet that's too small for the bed. Every time you pull it in one direction, you're losing something in the other direction. So good. It's wonderful to be machmir. Let's assume I make a kaviyas. I'm going to get up for tikkun chatzos. That's great. Wonderful, tikkun chatzos. But if that means I'm going to be tired in davening and not learn so well, is it worth it? Or I'm going to take on a chumrah of something, but it's going to impact on my shalom bayis. I'll be more irritable to my wife and to my children. So should I be machmer b'chiyai gavna? Right, the answer is no, because you have to determine what is the more important direction. So think about it once again as a tablecloth. I pull it in this direction, I lose something there. I pull it back over there, I lose something here. Right? So the avodah of Musar is very, very complicated in that area because you always have to assess what are you gaining and what are you losing, and that will change in time. Maybe that's why the Rambam gives more examples of doing good things, because there, usually that's going to just build you up. When you try to work on the negatives, you're going to have these conflicting ideas. Okay, so that's the first point of Perek Dalet, the idea of refuas hanefesh by repetitive virtuous action. And there I was showing you that could be understood, Al Pi the Malbim, as actually the machlokas Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai on v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Now, just as a little digression, I want to point out that the Hakdama to the Ein Yaakov by Rav Yaakov ibn Chaviv brings a medrash that we do not have in our medrash, so we don't know where he got it from. That there's actually a third opinion. What's the most important mitzvah, right? Rabbi Akiva says, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. And Ben Azai says, Hashem made man in the image of God. There's a third opinion that says, no. The most important pasuk in the Torah is Es hakeves ha'echad taseh baboker v'es hakeves ha'sheni taseh bein araboyim. That in the morning you bring a lamb for the korban tamid of the morning, and in the afternoon you bring another lamb for the korban tamid of the afternoon. Now, we don't have that in our medrash, but the Baal Ein Yaakov brings us as a medrash. So the question is, obviously every pasuk in the Torah is important, of course. But why would you single that out as most important? What is so preeminently important about Es HaKeves HaEchad? Say Shema Yisrael. Say other psukim. Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. What's so important about this? So the Bali Musar who identified this Ein Yaakov in the Hakdama, they say there's an important yesod of consistency in Avodas Hashem. Because once again, it goes back to our emotions. There are times we're inspired and we're going to daven, 3 hours with Hislavos. And that's great. And the next day, just forget it. I'm going to sleep in today. What the Korban Tamid teaches us is exactly this idea. You're constant. You're not changing. You do what you have to do every day, even if you don't feel up to it, even if you're not so enthusiastic. And that's very important because although obviously, as the Rambam says, Hashem wants us to be inspired. Hashem wants our neshamos to be in tikkun. But there are going to be times that we're not feeling that inspiration. And a person has to know that even when I don't have that inspiration, I do my job. This is a job, like all jobs. Again, the analogy of going to work, right? Maybe in Eretz Yisrael it's a little foreign, but in most societies, people go to work. Now, when you go to work, of course, if you're sick, you're sick. But generally speaking, you're not going to say, I'm not up to it today. You got to do it. So at a minimum, Torah is, of course, much, much more than that. And it has to be more than that. But at a minimum, it is a job. And if it's a job, you got to do it. And that's what Korban Tamid. So in a way, it's a fallback position. Rabbi Akiva and Ben Hazai, you're talking about how do I reach the level of love? But we need the third teaching to say, even when you're not holding there, it's a job, and you got to do it. In fact, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky once said, it's funny, but it's also a bit of a biting word. When he was Yeshiva of Torah V'das, and yeshiva guys were always wanting to go to weddings and this and that, chasnas, Baruch Hashem, it's a simcha. And he didn't like people to go to every wedding out of town. He said, you're missing shir, you're missing sidorim, you're missing learning. So he said, he now understands the meaning of Ein ben chorin elamish osek batorah. Right? Pirkei Avos says, the only person who's a free person is a person who learns Torah. Of course, that has deep spiritual meaning. But he said, jokingly, now I understand it. When a person has a job, they just can't take off every day to go to a wedding. When they're learning Torah, they feel they can take off every day, for something. He says, so a person who's learning Torah thinks he's mamash ben chayrin. And the answer is you got to treat it like a job, right? So that's the idea of consistency. And consistency is an important yesod because that gets us through the moments and the hours and the days when we don't always feel that inspiration. So you kind of need that fallback position to rely upon. Okay, we'll stop here. Take care.